Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of the Time for Impact. Chris Wade here and I'm with my co-host Matt Cobble. Hi Matt, how are you? Are you having a good day?
Hi Chris, I am having a brilliant day because it's Volunteers Week. How exciting is that? What a week.
And funny you should say that because this is the Volunteers Week special edition that we're recording today, and we're recording on Tuesday the 3rd of June, which is also the Power of Youth Day, which is, I'm sure we'll hear more about later on, but is incorporated or connected with the Volunteers Week initiative on this occasion today, celebrating youth social action as well as volunteering. Who have we got with us today? I hear you shout. We have two guests, both representing the Volunteer Week initiatives here in the UK. And first of all, we have Margaret Starkie, who's the Partnerships and Communications Manager at Volunteer Scotland. Hi, Margaret. Nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you too.
And we have Pinkney, who is, well, Dom, you've got so many titles, I don't know where to start, but CEO of the Volunteer Centres in Hammersmith and Fulham and in Camden, CEO of Works for You, who are also sponsors of Volunteers Week. And if you don't know them, they're employee volunteer specialists. And also co-chair of organisations as well. I won't go through them all. You can tell us a bit later on, Dom, if you wish to. But it's good to have you with us as well, Dom. Nice to see you.
It's great to be here. And I apologise for having the titles. No, I mean, just my world is volunteering in lots of different forms, but very excited to be here. It's Volunteers Week, obviously the biggest volunteering campaign in the UK of the year. So, yeah, really great to be here, sort of talking to you guys about it.
No, we'll don't ever apologise for all those things you do, Dom. It's great, and that's social action in action as well. Yeah, so let's start there. I don't know who wants to kick off. A good number of our listeners aren't in the UK, so not everybody will know about Volunteers Week. I'm guessing most people in the UK probably will know a little bit, but won't know everything, and some will be newer to volunteering than others. Volunteer Week has been around, I'm told, for 41 years, which in itself is pretty impressive. Maybe who wants to tell us a little bit about Volunteers Week, what it's all about, where it comes from, what its ambitions are?
Volunteers Week is, I said, it's UK's biggest volunteering campaign. It's been going 41 years, which is absolutely amazing. For anyone who works in the voluntary community sector, it's a bedrock. It's something that's there. It's something we kind of look forward to. We plan and enjoy as a time to celebrate and recognise volunteers.
Absolutely, as Dom says, it's quite significant that it's hit its 41st year this year. Last year, for its 40th anniversary, we did a complete rebrand of it, so we tried to bring it up to date a little bit more, which was met with great enthusiasm. It's just such a well-known campaign. We at Volunteer Scotland have taken on the lead coordination of it this year. It's fantastic. Some of the socials that are happening as we speak now, the volunteer stories, everything like that are just so amazing. There was a quote that I saw on socials yesterday from an organisation saying that volunteering is the invisible thread that binds our communities together. And that's what Volunteers Week is really about. It's about recognising that significant impact that volunteers make.
I think, so if I jump in, that invisible thread, and I suppose it's making that invisible thread visible, isn't it? Yes. Really, it's that kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about how it's organised, how Volunteers Week comes back? It doesn't happen by accident. It's a lot of hard work and organisation that goes into the week.
Yeah, so it's led by, like I say, the 4 nations across the UK. So Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England. And the UK Volunteering Forum are the overall lead and governance of the week. So we basically just work together, look at all the different social activities, pull together. You'll see on the website, which is a new website that was launched this year as well, that fact that Volunteer Scotland has taken on that development as well. So you'll see there that there is a wealth of resources, there's opportunities to tell your stories. I mean, some of the resources are improved, I believe, every year, and there's new resources added on. We always ask for feedback from organisations as to what they've used, what's worked well, what we'd like to see change, and ironically, organisations still love the bunting And you would think even nowadays, but they still love to download the bunting. They love to download the selfie frames. We have certificates, we have thank you cards. And this year we have created a new online community through a Padlet platform as well. So people can, organisations and volunteers themselves can put their stories up. And it's really building that massive community as well. So it's a lot of planning, a lot of work. We launched it earlier this year. We launched it in January. Normally we would launch the campaign in March, but we were able to launch it earlier this year. And I think we're even hoping to launch it even earlier for next year going forward. It's like with any campaign such as this, we're not just planning and working on 2025, we're also planning 2026 campaign as it is. And a new thing this year is the sponsorship aspect of it. And this is where Dom has come in and kindly been able to sponsor the campaign, which has allowed us to do some other new things. For example, there are going to be billboards across the UK throughout this week. So Glasgow, London, Belfast, Cardiff, Birmingham, and some others as well. So there's going to be, that's a massive significance for us as well this year.
Yeah, hopefully allowing Volunteers Week to reach further and bigger impact. And on that note, I mean, you must have some targets, I guess, at least internally around what you think success looks like for Volunteers Week, what in terms of the impact on the week, but also the legacy that follows.
Yeah, so the way that we look at it is obviously we have all the analytics that we have to back up this in terms of everything on the sites and the socials and everything like that as well. But one of the targets is receiving, at least 200 volunteer stories that are shared through our socials. So we track that as well. We provide the resources, but we don't dictate to organisations how they use them or what they want to use them for. We have targets in terms of our reach. In terms of organisations engaging with it. We always do a follow-up survey afterwards with stakeholders that will go direct to stakeholders that have subscribed, but also to out on socials as well, so we can gather that information. I mean, previous stats is that across the UK previous years we've reached over 2 million audience in terms of participating in Volunteers Week as well. We use every year as that sort of benchmark to try and improve going forward every year.
Sure.
I think one of the things I'm quite interested in with Volunteers Week, and I guess having been involved with this week pretty much throughout all my years as a sort of volunteering professional, it seems to be like the conversation sort of often lands into sort of two camps around what to do in Volunteers Week. And we often my experience is we often do a bit of both, which is taking time to sort of celebrate and recognise volunteers, and also taking time to spotlight the work of volunteers, but with an eye to getting more people involved and celebrating through a sort of inspiring lens, I suppose. How can we use this as an opportunity or a moment to go, hey, volunteering is great, why don't you come in and join in, sort of thing. I suppose I'm interested from your perspectives, it's Volunteers Week. What would your message be to someone who isn't volunteering at the moment? Why is Volunteers Week, a great time to try volunteering for the first time? I suppose what should organisations who are looking to involve volunteers think about with respect to that during Volunteers Week?
I'll go for that first. It's if someone who hasn't sort of volunteered yet and is sort of thinking about it, and I think Volunteers Week is a great time for people to think, oh, okay, yeah, actually, there's lots of people volunteering. Maybe I should look at that too. Volunteering, so many kind of benefits to it, and people often feel like volunteering has to be this altruistic thing, but actually, volunteering is just a great way to get involved in your local community, to meet new people, to use your skills in a new way, to do something that you care about, particular cause, whether it's something sort of charitable, the environment, whatever it might be. But yeah, the benefits of that are often people kind of go into volunteering thinking, okay, I'm doing something to help out, but often they get a lot back more than what they're expecting. And so when people start volunteering, they often keep volunteering because they think, wow, what an amazing thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things in the campaign is that we obviously, as you said, Matt, there is trying to inspire new and potential volunteers. And that's We do that by the existing volunteers and organisations telling their stories. And we also share a lot of the data that we have in terms of the health benefits. We know that there are significant health benefits to volunteering for mental health and various different things like that as well. So we do a lot of promotion of that during Volunteers Week and try and entice people to think, well, maybe I should do something. Again, we work with organisations to try and think about how flexible they can think of their opportunities, because we know, again, through analysis and data, that sometimes that is the stumbling block for people. They don't think they have time. So in Scotland, we have a national volunteer recruitment campaign running just now. So we do align that with the Volunteers Week campaign as well. It's about creating that community. Volunteers Week is about creating that community. We know that community is there, but it's about bringing that community together to share not just their good news stories, but everything that volunteering is and why it's so significant. We can go on about the economic value that volunteering brings to the UK economy, but this weekend in particular, it's about the difference that volunteers make, not about the economy, but about to the organisations and about to the people that they support as a volunteer. I'm thinking of examples around isolation and loneliness and various different things like that as well. It's about shouting from the rooftops, really, in terms of how important and how impactful volunteers are.
I think on that, it's a really great point about shouting, because I think, well, I don't know if it's a British culture thing of being kind of reserved and not shouting about it. There are so many people who are giving their time in lots of different ways, but we don't hear about it. We don't know about it. And when we hear about it, go, oh, okay, actually volunteering there's sort of a mismatch between our perception of how much volunteering is taking place and the reality. And the reality is obviously a lot more. But actually, we want more people to get involved. And the Volunteers Week is such an important time to sort of showcase that actually there are so many people doing it. And others go, oh, yeah, actually, yeah, they're doing it. Maybe, yeah, well, that's cool. Maybe I should check it out too and see what's possible. And you said about time. The research over years is like why the barriers to volunteering, the two most common ones are don't have enough time or no one asked me. And Volunteers Week is a great way of kind of combating both of those things, because there are lots of opportunities that can be done within time. And Volunteers Week is a way of saying, hey, we're asking you, hey, there's volunteers are needed. Go and check out what you might do.
And the billboard in some ways is a good example of that, because Volunteers Week as an organisation, if you like, or as a concept, is a marketing concept that, is run by various agencies, but it relies firstly on that communication and that community building, I suppose, of all the other charities and all the other volunteering organisations stepping up, sharing their stories, celebrating their volunteers. So you're providing a platform to them, but equally they provide the material, if you like, for you to use the Volunteering Week as a megaphone to broadcast, in a sense. Yeah. But the next level up is, in my head, is about how do you use the Volunteers Week, the marketing concept, to promote that value of volunteering, the monetary value you mentioned, but also the social value that volunteering brings, and encourage people to get involved. And you almost need to have, your own website's useful and your partners' websites, charity websites are useful, but actually we need to reach out into, it feels to me, into other audiences to really get to push that message, to augment that message further. The billboards are a start in that, but it's quite hard, isn't it, to get TV coverage, radio coverage, press coverage, etc. on volunteering in general. I'm hoping that around the week there's a better chance that even if you're not doing it, the local charities are getting into the local radio stations, etc., and talking about Volunteers Week. And do you have any sort of views about how you are trying to sort of further that ambition across Volunteers Week to really sell the story of volunteering outside the sector and beyond volunteers, perhaps?
Yeah, we do know that there's a lot of there are third sector interfaces like volunteer centres in Scotland that have some of their own radios, and actually because the radio stations and because they're so much better connected community-wise, they have access to a lot more of the community radios and various different things like that. So yes, the campaign is relying on organisations such as that, using going back to resources, we offer resources on how to engage with MSPs, how to engage with local media and things like that as well. So again, we ask all our partners, all our stakeholders to engage with that, and what we ask in return is that they share that information.
Quick explainer, just for our international listeners, MSPs are members of the Scottish Parliament.
In the billboards itself this year, it's not just Volunteers Week, it's about have you thought about volunteering as well. So, and again, this year, as I've said, but with Dom's sponsorship as well, we've been able to do that as next year, as we progress even further, we will be looking for even further media. We did have some social media influencers lined up to participate, but unfortunately, because of personal circumstances, that didn't happen. But again, we've started to really open those doors for 2026 and make those connections. So excited that we're in 2025 campaign, but I'm really excited about 2026 as well. And again, things like bringing in a recruitment campaign as well is just exciting.
It's such a collaborative campaign, which I think is such a great way of doing it, involving so many different organizations, whether it's individual volunteer involving organizations, the volunteer infrastructure organization, all those all participate and help spread that message. And I was doing a bit of work recently. We launched the London Vision for Volunteering in March, which is kind of like a blueprint for developing volunteering in the capital, but it has a lot of relevance to the UK as well. And we were talking about the promotion of volunteering, and it's like, if you're a typical London, and this will be the same with the rest of the UK, but we are bombarded with messages from the moment we wake up, whether it's text messages or on online shopping stores, emails, on your travel to work, you see it on the buses, in the tube, at work, you get emails. What percentage of that is about promoting volunteering? And it's a tiny percent. This is why Volunteers Week is one of the few moments we have, those campaigns where actually that message gets out. But I think that the sort of Margaret and her colleagues are doing such a great job, and it's building and promoting. But it's a lot harder to do that in 2025 than say it was 20 years ago. It's a lot more competition. You're competing with all the global brands and everything else. So
it feels to me quite an interesting sort of mindset shift to think of like Volunteers Week as almost as the start of a marketing campaign, or the start of a sort of, and if the marketing campaign is about recognition and is about volunteering and is about celebrating volunteers, I think that's really exciting. I think one of the things I've struggled with Volunteers Week, I think, over the years, is this sentiment sometimes that it can feel a bit like Valentine's Day for volunteers. So if I were being cynical about it, which I'm not, and I think there's a really interesting mindset shift, I've had to make over the years. I think that it's, clearly we don't just want to be recognising and celebrating volunteers 1 week a year. Clearly that's something we should be doing all the time in ways that are meaningful. And seeing this as part of a longer term journey of recognition and marketing and all that's great about volunteering is really exciting. What would you say is the secret, I suppose, to making our Volunteers Week work more like a campfire that's going to keep burning, and less like a firework that's going to fizzle out instantly, sort of thing? What would you say to that?
Well, I'll start. So I think, because obviously you talked about the couple of different levels that Volunteers Week works at, but the other level it works at that people use is that kind of influencing other stakeholders about why volunteering is important. And that goes from within volunteering involving organizations, because lots of them who involve volunteers do it where the volunteer manager is the person who manages it, and they're not really connected to the rest of the organization, or the leadership is not built in. So it's a way of the rest of the organization sort of recognizing and saying, actually volunteers are a really important part of how our organization works. Also influencing funders, local authorities, regional governments, central government about, okay, this is actually why volunteers are kind of essential to what we do. So it's raising that profile and importance to lead to other conversations. So I have a dangerous talking about it near to lunch, but I have my sort of cake analogy. So I feel that so volunteering is people think in a sentimental way, volunteering is nice, but it's seen more as being like the icing on the cake of society. Whereas I argue, actually, if you look at it, volunteering is a key ingredient of the cake itself. If every volunteer, whether informally or formally, stopped volunteering tomorrow, our society will come very quickly to a halt in so many different ways, but it's not seen that way. So Volunteers Week has that way of raising that profile, perhaps starting those other conversations to mean that volunteering is important all year round, not just in Volunteers Week.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about, volunteers and the contribution that they make throughout the year as well. And we know that organisations do that, but a lot of organisations as well, certainly from feedback we've received, they do like that, to have that significant, that 1 week a little bit, because then that's when they'll have things like the awards ceremonies, and they'll do various different things, have events and things like that as well. So I think it allows the organisations to have a little bit more of a control as to when they can have this type of activity as well, in terms of events and things like that. But obviously we know that they recognise their volunteers' contribution throughout their time as well. Yeah, Matt, I completely understand in what you're saying. It's that around that, thing of Volunteers Week type of Valentine's Day type approach, but it's about getting organisations to understand the significance and the benefit and the need for volunteers and what they contribute, and that hopefully message carries on throughout the rest of the year.
Also to add that, as with my sort of volunteer centre hats on, so at Volunteer Centre Camden and Hammersmith and Fulham Volunteer Centre, we treat Volunteers Week practically as a Volunteers Month. So during the week, lots of organisations will be doing something internally, but we will do things either the week before or a couple of weeks after, because we know then organisations may be more free to participate in things. So we're already expanding it in a practical sense.
Well, there's food for thought for 2026. A month.
I think it's true also that, and maybe it shouldn't be, but I know from my own sort of experience of organisational life, and you might reflect this as well, Matt, that internally it is the 1 week of the year, sometimes in organisations, where you can get your internal communications team and your CEO to really turn the focus onto volunteering. You can gain control of the communication and marketing strategy and outcome for at least 1 week, if you can't other weeks during the year. So it has an internal impact as well. And I think there's something also about internal learning especially I'm thinking in larger organisations perhaps, where there's lots of colleagues who don't get particularly involved in volunteering. So it's also an opportunity to engage them in the conversation about the value that volunteering brings to their organisation and their causes as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation with, obviously Works for You being an employee volunteering specialist, had a meeting with a business last Friday who, are going to use Volunteers Week as a great way for doing some comms. Their company has gone through sort of like a sort of merger, and they're looking to reinvigorate their volunteering program. And that's a great way that kind of week to kind of kickstart a good excuse for that kind of messaging. So it has lots of different sort of uses.
I was also going to ask about, forgive me if I'm adding extra elements to Volunteers Week than what you planned, but there's also something around Volunteers Week around shared learning. The thing I haven't seen, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, is there's so much of the shared learning between organisations. So those case studies are so rich. We all post something on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on Instagram about volunteering in our organisations, and I'm sure we all read our own organisation stories. But actually, maybe I get it as a consultant. I can sit back and read all different organisations' little snippets and stories, and there's such a richness in those celebrations and those experiences and those examples. There's case studies there that we could all be kind of using as learning opportunities, and I don't know whether Volunteers Week itself has got the capacity to help capture some of that learning, but it feels to me that there's, in a time when volunteering professionals are often, when I speak to, often grappling with changes in the world of volunteering and changes in volunteering behaviour and frequency and so on, it feels like there's a really rich learning archive that comes out of this that perhaps we could be leveraging further.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, we collate all the case studies that come through for Volunteers Week, and that's obviously through socials and that new online community that I'd mentioned as well. And we do share as much as possible back out to ensure that organisations can see what other organisations are doing. As you say, organisations, some of them are just surviving on a shoestring. So if they can get some ideas on how to be creative around recruitment and recognition from another organisation, that's another main point of sharing those case studies. We have looked at potentially doing an exhibition for Volunteers Week later on in the year. Again, it is something that we will consider. We have certainly looked at it in Scotland, something that we could look at in terms of a UK side of things. And that would really be about sharing those case studies and sharing those stories as well. We always, we have a parliamentary event this week in Scotland where we will be recognising volunteers as well. It's through our cross-party group and volunteering. And we know just from even just those case studies, them coming along to Parliament and getting that recognition is something that then inspires them to then tell others to want to volunteer and things like that. So it's not just about organisations sharing what they're doing during Volunteers Week. It's also about volunteers, as you say, sharing the importance and that recognition that they're getting as well. So yeah, it's something that we are considering for the future.
There's learning events, of course, as well. And I know I'm off to Belfast at the end of this week for Volunteers Week. Shout out to Volunteer Now, Volunteers Week event to do a keynote for them, so that I know there's learning.
Maybe it's a good sort of point to mention because there's so much that around the volunteering world. And obviously Volunteers Week is, or maybe if it's Volunteers Month next year, there could be more components to it. So one of those around volunteer managers and coordinators, who obviously are kind of an essential and perhaps sort of undervalued kind of resource, because great volunteer managers and coordinators do such an amazing job and bringing together and recruiting and looking after and motivating volunteers to carry out work. That's sort of part of the work that we do as volunteer centres. So we use Volunteers Week to have sort of sessions. So Volunteer Centre Camden tomorrow has a volunteer managers network where volunteer managers will come together and share their learning and experience and support each other.
I thought it'd be interesting to bring us back to the notion of recognition, and also back to something that Chris said at the top of the podcast about, we're recording this on the 3rd of June, which is the Power of Youth Day. And I think it would be interesting to explore that a little bit, because it feels to me sometimes in, Volunteers Week and in volunteer recognition in general, actually, we can sometimes be guilty of celebrating or recognising sort of people who've been around a long time at the expense of people who've perhaps not been around as long but have made a big impact. So maybe tenure versus impact, right? I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and there's a place to celebrate all different kinds of contributions during Volunteers Week. But I think it is a great opportunity for us to think about recognition in its broadest sense and all the different kinds of things about volunteering we might want to celebrate. Which probably brings me on to Power of Youth Day. I just wondered if Margaret or Dom, you wanted to talk a little bit about that, what it means, what we're focusing on today, and why it's important.
Yeah, Power of Youth Day is part of the I Will campaign as well. So it really is about recognising that sort of youth leadership aspect of it, and a lot of the youth VIPs, and they are obviously volunteers, a lot of them as well. So it's really recognising that youth element inside of it, and actually, again, it's about encouraging the young to start to volunteer as early as possible and see it as a pathway to other things. It's not, and again, it's also about recognising that it's not just, retired people that volunteer or anything like that. There is that option of for young people to create pathways into careers, to, again, some of the data that we've had through youth surveys, as well as around volunteers within youth, being able to volunteer with a friend, it's building their confidence, it's giving them those skills that they can take to university or elsewhere as well. So it really is it's a day for recognising youth, young people in particular. And we're happy and supportive that the day is always fits within Volunteers Week as well.
Yeah, I think anything that kind of helps promote and encourage younger people to get involved in volunteering is a positive thing. That kind of volunteering as being a lifelong activity. And it reminds me, I think it was a few years ago, I think it was before COVID, and there was this big push to get older people to volunteer. I think people just said, oh, well, there's resources not being used. And the research shows if you want more older people to volunteer, get them to volunteer when they're younger, and then they will be doing it when they're older. That's the way to do it. So, yes. I think it's great to be able to sort of focus on that, because I think there's lots of great opportunities for young people to get involved, that will develop their skills, their networks. There's so many benefits.
And actually this year, an additional resource that we did create was about how to engage with schools as well. So we offered quite a few templates and design work for schools to recognise their pupils that are actually volunteering. I mean, I know just even personally, when my daughter was at primary school, she became a primary 7. She was a buddy for a P1 that was just starting as well. And that's not recognised as volunteering, but it is. So again, it's how we get the schools on board. And again, it's something for 2026 that we're going to do much more. But again, we're getting lots of really nice stories from schools and how young people are volunteering.
Matt, you're talking about kind of recognition and kind of people who do award ceremonies. So I always get frustrated, and I understand why it happens, but when people have volunteer awards, and it's always about who's the winner of this particular award, and it's always someone who's done the most amount of volunteering, and then there are like runners up or losers who tend, and I think that's a terrible feeling in it. So when we do volunteer awards, and I organised one back in March, we kind of said it's not about how many hours or whether you're the best volunteer. It's like any organisation who wants to thank a volunteer can nominate them for an award. And it meant that we recognised about 150 people, and we got through it sort of quickly, but the momentum was good, and actually everybody just felt like, okay, yeah, someone just noticed and recognised the fact that I do some volunteering. I don't necessarily do. I know a little amount of volunteering. It wasn't about that. It was just...
If Volunteers Week is a celebration, and it's a celebration of all that's great about volunteering and volunteers and the contributions they make. There's a chance for us to have our own parties, right, within our organisations, with our own space. But we mustn't forget as well that Volunteers Week is also a chance to have a big collective kind of volunteering metaphorical street party, right, where where everyone can see what's great about volunteering, including people who make really important decisions about our infrastructure and investment in some of these services and functions of society. So that there's a message there, isn't there? There's a message there for the people who are doing it, and and know volunteering is already great and powerful and important, which is thank you, you're valued, you're appreciated, you're seen. And there's a message for others, isn't there, which is look at this, look how brilliant it is, look how important it is, we need your help to make more of it happen, sort of thing, feels to me.
Yeah, so tomorrow, so the Scouts have been doing some great work and sort of policy work to try and get some discussion around whether for employee volunteering, employees should get sort of 35 hours worth of volunteering as a sort of almost like a statutory right. And so there's a parliamentary roundtable discussion tomorrow. So that'll be kind of interesting to see kind of, there's all these different areas that are people kind of pushing that kind of conversation. And I think, Matt, you're absolutely right about that. It's a chance to influence some of those other sort of stakeholders and decision makers. But the messaging is very different. So the street party is about, we know why volunteering is great and everything else. But there are people out there who don't necessarily understand. They may have a sentimental feeling about volunteering as nice, but they may not have, because we don't necessarily have all the monetary economic value data, which is not necessarily useful for a volunteer manager's day-to-day work. But in terms of influencing, it's very important, because obviously difficult economic times, people having to make decisions, and if they don't have some of that data, then they're not going to make that decision. That's why there's so many different messaging that needs to take place. There's that quote that's often used in the sort of volunteering world about volunteers are not paid not because they're worthless, but because they're priceless, which is a fantastic sense, and it's lovely. But if you're someone who's got to make a decision about budgets and things, it's useless in that sense. That kind of messaging and influencing of those stakeholders is important, and something that as a sector we need to do more of, so that those people can have the good information so they can feel that they make the appropriate decisions.
You're pushing all the right buttons, Dom, on a podcast called Time for Impact. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons we set this up, was because we really wanted to push beyond exactly what you describe as the volunteering being a great thing into actually demonstrating the impact that volunteering has on our society. And that's quite difficult for a small any organisation sometimes to do, but I think it's essential. But I think something like Volunteers Week can play a part in that, as almost as a conduit for that kind of research. Maybe not the financial value, but the societal impact of volunteering will come through loud and clear through things like Volunteers Week. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm interested in sort of pushing, and I'll be doing what I call the volunteering multiplier principle. So that if you invest in increased volunteering, that actually it gives a much better, bigger return in terms of stronger communities and people supporting each other and the benefits. Whereas if you reduce volunteering, then the multiplier works in a negative way. So it's kind of looking at those, trying to get those kind of arguments there about showing what an impact that the volunteer, because volunteering is one of these things that kind of is cross-cutting across so many different elements of our society, health and sport, wherever it might be, even like law, police, the military, so many areas that actually it's really important, but that is not necessarily people aware of that.
Yeah, so another big awareness role for Volunteers Week to play.
So, Margaret, Dom, thanks ever so much for joining us and for sharing your insights and your inspiration around Volunteers Week. I'm sure our listeners will already be getting involved if they're in the UK, but hopefully this will spur them into even further action. And who knows, people in other parts of the world may be listening to this story and thinking, we need to do something similar in X, Y, and Z countries as well. So who knows, your reach may go even further. So thanks for joining us. Been really lovely having you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Hello, Chris Wade here. Just a quick note to say that if you enjoy these podcasts, please to subscribe, follow, etc. for more episodes. There are many more in the bank already, and many more to come in the future. We've got lots of really good guests lined up, so keep listening. And if you think your colleagues or other people will enjoy the podcast, please do share. It's the best way to get that word out is through word of mouth. If Time for Impact can help you in your organisations to rethink your volunteering strategy, if you need volunteering training or any other volunteering speaking or thinking exercises, please do think about Time for Impact. We're always available to help organisations large and small. If you want to get in touch, please get in touch at podcast@timeforimpact.co.uk. Thank you.